running with centralized back offices, centralized services, you should be able to save a lot of administration money. And if you can save a lot of administration money, all of those savings, in addition to the 0.5% that is embedded in this document for the QCTO, all of those savings should also then go to the QCTO. And it's anticipated that by the time we're finished with implementation of everything, and I'm going to talk about what everything means, but by the time we're finished with implementation, the QCTO should be looking at something close to possibly 5% of the skills levy to fund its activities. 0.5% formally, and then all of the savings that get affected from the administration budget. I think that's a good thing, by the way, if business is allowed to be actively involved in the QCTOs and the organized business community does not have a wall put up against its involvement, and instead nominal token employees in the business community are put onto the accounting authority of the QCTO and all the other structures, as unfortunately is the stated case in this document. Before I go any further, any questions, any comments anyone wants to make?
No.
All right. Stan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm here. Nothing from me. Please continue.
Okay, good. All right. So let's talk about the CETAs and what this document has to say about the CETAs. Well, basically, it says that as far as the CETAs are concerned, CETAs are not working well. There's little coordination. There's little consistency. CETAs are not meeting their targets. And in fact, CETAs are not making sure that people who are trained on learnerships and internships, etc., are finding full-term, sustainable, decent work. And decent work is defined by the International Labour Organization as work directly related to the areas for which they've been trained in. So a practical example, a doctor is now a waiter because he can't get a job as a doctor. You can't argue with the criticism against the majority of CETAs because in reality, CETAs are not professionally managed. They're not professionally chaired, governed in terms of their accounting authority makeup because the people who sit on the boards of the CETAs, ostensibly representing the business community nominated by the minister, really know nothing about business generally. So CETAs are failing. They're not spending the money where they need to spend it, and the money is being swept. Some would argue the money is being swept purposefully. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Over the last 4 years, the Department of Higher Education and Training has had to find money, billions of rands, to pay for fees must fall. The money in the National Skills Fund, which was 20% of the skills levy, just was not enough to pay for fees must fall. But if you sweep unused, unspent money from the 20-odd CETAs, suddenly you have enough money collectively from the skills levy to fund fees must fall. And fees must fall has been well funded over the last 3 years, hasn't it? And we go into another year now that it will need to be funded again. So there is method in the madness of dysfunctional CETAs. There's method in the construction of a scenario where you have to sweep money from a CETA because otherwise that money gets swept by Treasury and never seen again. So CETAs are dysfunctional. No argument about that. So what this document now, and we've known this has been coming for a long time, what this document does is it says what will happen to CETAs. Well, number one, CETAs will now become statutory bodies which are departments within the Department of Higher Education and Training. So CETAs will become statutory bodies which are departments in the Department of Higher Education and Training. They won't therefore be subject to a 5-year lifeline any longer because every 5 years CETAs have to reapply to be relicensed. They will be statutory bodies ad infinitum, into infinity. Provision will still be made for administration of CETAs that are dysfunctional, but essentially CETAs will become departments within the Department of Higher Education Training, number one. Number two, the landscape of CETAs will be rationalized. So what does that mean? Where possible and relevant, the use of technology will be harnessed to standardize processes across all CETAs improve efficiencies, increase stakeholder involvement through online portals, accurate data analysis for improved decision-making. Sounds great. It's a good plan. Except to say that this whole thing about information technology has been going around and around and around. SAP were involved. A number of organizations have been involved for the last 10, 15 years in trying to make this happen for the department. Millions, hundreds of millions of rands have been spent on these efforts. Nothing to show for it yet. There's absolutely no indication that anything will change in that regard. There's no indication that the rationalization exercise of creating well-scaled back offices, white labeling for seaters, being able to service those seaters on an economy of scale basis. There's no indication that what is a good strategy can be implemented functionally by the people currently running the system, because quite frankly, they haven't done it up until now. They've had 20 years to do it and they haven't done it. But there is an indication that it will be a very lucrative opportunity to funnel money into tenders and contracts to do these kinds of exercises afresh, anew, to ignore everything that's been commissioned by tenders and contracts in the last 20 years, and to start doing it again now and incur the same sorts of expenses. There's a very strong indication that that's the likelihood. This document says this. It says it has been agreed that some rationalization and streamlining of processes and structures should take place to consolidate the skills landscape, to reduce overlaps, enable efficient use of scarce resources, ensure effective collaboration. Very noble. It's what has to happen. So what this document says specifically is that we're going to end up with fewer seaters, more centralized back offices, and what that's going to do is it's going to reduce the administration load on each of the seaters so that that huge saving can be affected from the administration budget that can then be paid to the QCTO to fund the QCTO function. It's a very noble objective, but you've got to look at the people implementing it and managing it to see what the likelihood of anything productive coming out of it is in fact going to be. I would argue that this document says rationalize, but there are no controls from the people paying the levies, which is the private sector, over how that's done. There's also no control over how those tenders get awarded and who they get awarded to in the process. And I think that's a massive gap in this entire document, because the accounting authorities are selected, nominated and selected by the Minister of Higher Education and Training. The private sector has no final say in how those accounting authorities are put together. And in fact, this document talks specifically about conflict of interest, about saying if you're a levy-paying company, you have a conflict of interest in governing how your money is used. And it should rather be government and government's nominees and employees who make that decision, because they do not have that conflict of interest. And I think that's a massive gap in this document, quite frankly, a gap of credibility. With the rationalization of seaters, very dangerous and innocuous inclusion in this document is very specifically about one thing that I want to bring to your attention. And that is that what is proposed is a centralized department within the Department of Higher Education and Training, through which all applications for funding will go. So the applications for funding will not go to the seaters. They will go to the Department of Higher Education and Training, and going to the Department of Higher Education and Training, the final decision about who gets funding and what that funding is going to look like will come from the Department of Higher Education and Training in terms of 5-year plans which are developed by the seaters and the seater communities. So seater community might say, for example, in the contact center industry, we project that over the next 5 years we've got to create another 100,000 seats for argument's sake, and therefore we need providers who can do the basic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels of training required to populate those seats. The seater then sends that document through to the Department of Higher Education and Training. That document then gets consolidated into their 5-year plan as the department in terms of the scarce skills, which are real or probable skills. And then the message goes out to the provider community who wants to do the training to satisfy this 5-year need of the contact center industry. Those providers then make the application to the Department of Higher Education and Training that then makes a decision as to who's going to be the providers of choice and what money they're going to get. The CETAs and the stakeholder groupings within the CETAs, specifically the private business sector, have no say in making those decisions whatsoever. Very innocuous. Why is it innocuous? It is innocuous, in my opinion, because this document makes it very clear that the providers of choice will be the public sector training providers, those 50-odd, 60-odd colleges, and not the private training provider community. So the majority of you out there are now used to working with private training providers internally within your organization. You might have a training providing department, or externally you might contract them in, maybe from overseas. That stops. The only way you're going to be able to continue to have that funded out of the skills levy is if those private training providers are contracted by the public training providers. The public training providers get the money from the skills levy, from the National Skills Fund, or from one of the CETA plans through the department, and then they in turn contract and pay the private training providers. And so the pressure you have to then be placing as a collective industry represented by the CCMG is in giving one very clear message through to the Department of Higher Education and Training. We will not employ graduates of the public training provider fraternity. We will not employ a public training provider graduate if they've been trained in contact center work, unless a public training provider is using one or more private training providers that we're comfortable with, or unless we've had a direct input into what is done in that public training provider environment, who their lecturers are, what their course content is, how they assess, how they recruit the students, etc. Otherwise, those students are totally unemployable. They will remain unemployable as far as the private contact center sector is concerned. And that's a very strong statement. And Sharon, I think you need to make that statement. It's not for me to put words into the mouths of the CCMG. But the more I think about it, the more I think it's the only tool you have to force your way into owning how this NSDS4 is implemented as far as the contact center companies are concerned. I don't know if you have a comment in that regard.
Ivor, I agree with you. As we had discussed yesterday, what Ivor's putting on the table for all of us is absolutely shocking news. And the CCMG are now giving all of you an opportunity to comment, to participate, to say, we're not going to accept them. I mean, can you imagine the quality that's going to come out of various colleges and that? Unless they're all open-minded and strike a deal with, and they do the public-private sector, and they allow us to assist them. But then again, they can't afford the private sector. So, guys, we can't. We got to take a stand. And I agree, we need to say no. We will not be employing them. And yeah, so it's all so important. Thank you, Ivor.
I almost believe you need to do this. I believe you need to say to the Department of Trade and Industry, it's time to establish a charter for the contact center industry. In other words, we want to take the generic BBBE codes and we want to work them into a contact center industry charter where skills development, enterprise development, supplier development, all of the development angles, including equity, by the way, but all of the angles that are dependent on skills development are managed by us collectively as a contact center industry and not generically by the Department of Trade and Industry. I've never, by the way, heard the Department of Trade and Industry ever turn such an application down. They're wanting industries to grab the opportunities to create their own BBBE charters. Because if you do that, your access to 500% in excess of the 1% skills levy gives you a far greater bargaining power than you currently have within the CETA or the National Skills Development Strategy plan. And so I would recommend that you need to seriously think about that as the CCMG. Sorry, Candy, I see you keep flashing me.
No, I'm not sure why. I think it might have been because I muted and I've unmuted.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. So Yeah. So Sharon, I'm actually saying to you, I think you need to seriously consider saying to the DTI you want to establish a charter for contact centers as an industry sector to prevent the Department of Higher Education and Training basically capturing all the training and development and work placement opportunities within the contact center industry. See, something you have to understand collectively, ladies and gentlemen, is this. This proposal says something else. It says take the skills levy and use it to create a research supply chain of information from the companies to the Department of Higher Education and Training in terms of where the jobs are, in terms of how placements are being made, and in terms of how placements should be made. So the department is saying, we'll use the skills levy to pay for that research, when in fact there are government departments that have tax allocations to fund research activities, and they're not using those tax allocations. For example, the National Research Foundation has said, we cannot find researchers in South Africa. We're actually giving money to other African countries because more research is being conducted there with basically using South African tax money. And yet this National Skills Development Strategy says use the skills levy to conduct research. Use the skills levy to basically hold an industry to ransom based on the information that the companies in the industry gives. So they're using that 1% of payroll basically to capture every one of those industries, in my opinion, for the wrong reasons and not for the right reasons. And that's something you have to actively agitate against or succumb to. And I'm sorry to say that. It's one or the other. There's no middle road here, Sharon. Okay, moving on. So what I've tried to establish is there are going to be fewer SETAs, more back offices, and SETAs will share things like regional centers, offices. They might have centralized divisions amongst them, and none of that is bad. Rationalization is not bad, as long as it's being managed by professional managers and not for nefarious reasons. And I'm suggesting you read this NSDS document. It is full of nefarious implications. It is full of hidden agendas and nefarious implications. All right. So I want to emphasize this issue of entitlement, because any training provider in this discussion needs to be very wary if they're a private training provider, because what this document says is training providers who are private, your days are numbered. We don't want the skills levy to be used with you any longer. We do not want companies to be entitled to ask you to do the training rather than to have to take graduates from the public institutions and ask the public institutions to do the training or the retraining of the people who work in those businesses. So your days are numbered. And so, Sharon, I'm going to ask you to also circulate what Janelle sent through, which is the Association of I think she had the Association of Private Training Providers, APED's response to this legislation, this proposed NSDS4. And I think that also needs to be circulated to the training providers who are associated with the CCMG for their input. I would ask that is done and done quite urgently. If not, if they haven't done one of those inputs, then maybe we should be organizing a separate video conference only for training providers who operate in the contact center space, Sharon, both internal and external. I would suggest that might be a bit of a priority for you. In that regard. This document.
But sorry, Ivor, just guys, there's so much good that we can do, but we can't do it without your support. I mean, who are we without our members and the support of our members? We're the professional body, we're handing out designations, but if it's not being supported, what then? I mean, yes, we can go to the DTI, we can go and say we want to have a charter for our industry, but it's no use doing this if nobody buys into it or wants to come with us and volunteer.
Sharon, I think just from my perspective, a comment is, you know, whilst I'm listening to Ivor work through this, I mean, I'm sitting and my blood's boiling, and I'm sure we're all feeling it. But in principle, it sounds great to say, yes, let's come together, let's have some kind of movement forward, and lobby. However, you know, there's also the fact that, for example, we're a training provider with an anchor client. We, for example, also do recruitment for those anchor clients. It's about lobbying their support as well. And they're not really that interested in even listening to some of these comments. Do you know what I'm saying? They just want to say, listen, graduate or not, I want those people in place. So it's really about educating our business partners at the end of the day as well. Does it make sense?
I think that what Sharon has said all along is if you want these kinds of presentations to your clients, take us to your clients. Let us make the net wider in the sense of getting everybody behind whatever it is we want to do for the contact center industry.
Yeah.
All right. So let me move on.
Ivor?
Yes.
Ivor, can I ask you a question? So if the CCIs of the world or the Capitas of the world who might have registered themselves as training providers, are they going to be treated in the same way as and seen as a private training provider? These are businesses, contact centers, or BPOs. Will they also be seen in the same way as, say, a PMI who's a private provider?
So a training provider is only disadvantaged by this document in terms of their ability to either access the skills levy to fund their activities or to offset their expenses against, in terms of running their internal training activities against skills. But you've got to remember something that's very innocuous. This document doesn't just control access to the 1% skills levy. It controls the QCTO that's responsible for the accreditation of the training providers who generally would need to be accredited to offer qualifications or training out there, internally within a company or externally, which means that ultimately it's saying to a company that if your internal training department doesn't have a link to a public institution and shares the accreditation with that public institution, it cannot practice. You cannot spend money. Well, the reality is you cannot spend 85% of your skills development funding with your internal training department. You could only ever spend 15% of that budget on them, and it would be regarded as in-company training that's not accredited. That's the point. Now, what you've got to remember is it's not the 1% skill levy at stake here. It's the additional 5% triple BEE skills development funding that's at stake. Because that's a 500% increase in the skills levy that every company has to spend to become a measured triple BEE entity and therefore trade in the marketplace. So it goes way beyond just that 1% skills levy. So on the face of it, they can carry on doing what they're doing. But if they're not accredited, and this document controls how they're going to become accredited, who's going to do the work, and how they're going to be funded, then they're not going to be able to perform a service for either their own company or a client company in terms of that additional 5% of payroll spend.
Thank you.
It is, this is the dynamite that we have to be extinguishing if we're going to have a hope of doing anything for the private business sector in this country. That's the point. Okay. I want to, let me just quickly talk about the challenges that they're using to justify these draconian measures. They're saying, for example, that graduates who've been trained in the private or the public training provider environment have not found meaningful jobs, decent work where they're employed to do what they've been taught to do. I won't argue with that. I think it's a reality. They're saying that there's limited practical workplace experience that's being offered, so people are not finding jobs because of the teaching or the training they're exposed to. And they're saying that workplace learning at the moment is not integral as a part of a qualification or a program design. You can't argue with that, because I think a lot of that is generally true out there. So the challenge to, and everything works now in this document, it talks about a 5-year plan that a CETA has to do, identifying scarce skills and other opportunities that need to be addressed, and then a 3-year budgeting process. I'm suggesting that the CCMG has to do exactly that for the contact center sector. It has to develop a 5-year plan based on scarce, real, and probable needs. Real being that the jobs open we can't fill. Probable being that over the next 5 years the jobs are going to change and we need to create new animals. And then a 3-year budget requirement where you know you've got a commitment from CCMG member companies to say, if you can produce those animals, we'll take those animals over the next 3 years. because that then is a shopping list or a wish list given to the seaters that is integrated by the seaters into the department's plan, that then really their budgeting process is formalized around and against. So that's a demand-driven approach to getting your foot in the door, but there needs to be a supply-driven approach, which is determined by this document in terms of how access to that funding is actually being created to address those particular gaps. Before I talk about the skills levy itself, I just want to address one other issue that's critically important, and that's the issue of stakeholders. So this document is very specific about the fact that organized business, you guys, will not have an opportunity to have your spokespeople, your leadership, represented on the boards of seaters unless the minister approves those people and pre-selects those people. The supposition is that any of you or your leadership have a vested interest and therefore should not be in the accounting authorities. And therefore you have a scenario arising, for example, where Stumor Dlamini's wife, now Stumor Dlamini is president of COSATU, where his wife has actually run the education seater as chairperson, or where Gwedi Mantashe's wife was chairperson of the services seater for a full term of office. And quite frankly, where they are not from the contact center industry, they're not from the recruitment industry, etc., etc. So you've got this weird justification that because these people are removed from the business sector, they should be in charge of seaters, and that anyone from the business sector would in fact have a conflict of interest. And that's a very weird supposition which this document gives rise to, that I think really needs to be challenged, because it doesn't make logical sense, certainly not in my mind. It doesn't make logical sense. All right, so let's now talk about the money. In some ways, I like what this document says because it's very clear, and there are no issues of misinterpretation like there was under NSDS 3 of how the money gets divided up. And as I said, I'm going to type it for you to see. This document says that for every 100 Rand, which is paid as a skills levy, and remember the skills levy is 1% of total payroll. It says for every 100 Rand paid as a skills levy, the first 20 Rand goes to the Department of Higher Education and constitutes the National Skills Fund. Fine, that's the first 20 Rand. It then says that the next 20 Rand goes to companies as the mandatory skills grant, or 20% is the mandatory skills grant, which goes to the company. That's been reduced from 50 Rand in every 100 Rand to 20 Rand in every 100 Rand. Sorry about my spelling there. From there, it says that 5 Rand will go to the QCTO formally, and 10 Rand will be used for seater administration, but importantly, whoa, excuse my typing again, admin savings will go to the QCTO. Sorry, I'm just fixing up my typing. Savings will go to the QCTO. Okay? So that accounts for 20, 30, 40, 55 Rand. And then it says that 49 Rand 50. So I just want to add this up. 20, 30, 40, 50. So the balance really, 20, 30, 40. Sorry. Just for the moment, just let me type this up and say 49 Rand 50 will go to the seaters to be divided and spent on the priority programs approved by the Department of Higher Education and Training. I'm going to get the actual document out just so that I can see why I'm not able to articulate the real. Okay. So it says 20% of the seater levy paid in a sector will continue to go to seaters to be paid to workplaces for mandatory grants. Department, okay, maximum of 10% of the seater levy paid by the sector allocated for admin, so that makes it 30%. 0.5% of the seater levy allocated to by the seaters to the QCTO, and then 49.5% going to the seaters levy. So is that what I've got on what I've written up for you? 20, 30, 30, 40, yeah. Okay, so that's how the money gets divided up. That's how the money will get divided up. Essentially, 50%, which includes the 5 Rand for the QCTO, within the CETA will be used for CETA activities, plus another 10 Rand for administration purposes. That makes it 60, and then 20 Rand mandatory grant and 20 Rand National Skills Fund. That National Skills Fund gets used by the minister, essentially as her checkbook on national priorities, but up until now it's been used primarily for fees must fall in the last 3 to 4 years. That's how that money is being used. So it's very simple. It says the first 20 Rand gets taken off and gets given to the department. The next 20 Rand gets given back to the companies if they do an annual skills plan and annual skills plan report. 5 Rand goes to the QCTO, and 49 Rand 50 then goes to 49.5% goes to the CETAs, and the balance is used for administration purposes. Any questions in that regard? All right.
No, nothing from my side.
I was asked yesterday in a private WhatsApp just to explain where private sector companies can directly access. So private sector companies have no access to the National Skills Fund, so that first 20 Rand. Private sector companies have the total entitlement to that 20 Rand, which is a mandatory skill. They have no access to the QCTO, 5 Rand. They have no access to the 10 Rand CETA administration. And they have access to the 49 Rand 50 or the 49.5% that will be used within the CETAs, as long as the Department of Higher Education and Training will approve who the training providers are and what that money, in fact, will be spent for. All right, so that's very important, ladies and gentlemen. I just need you to understand that. Fair enough? Okay. So questions. We're at the stage now where I'm saying to you, are there any questions? Are there any concerns? Anything anybody wants to say to add to what we've said so far in terms of unpacking the National Skills Development Strategy 3 document?
Well, certainly from my perspective, it's most definitely looking to squeeze out any private or rather, training providers, and that certainly seems to be one of its objectives.
Let me play devil's advocate here and say, do you understand why the government have proposed this National Skills Development Strategy? Do you understand that what they're saying is that the private sector is ignoring the majority of people who are being trained in the public training institutions funded by the government? They're ignoring those graduates unless those graduates, in addition to what they've been exposed to in the public training institutions, somehow, unless those graduates qualify to get into a private training provider and be exposed to private training providing programs. And therefore, that something has to change, that the vast majority of unemployed graduates out there, that unemployment level is being caused by the private sector, which wants to run separate to the public sector. Is that understandable?
Sure. Yes.
And if that is the challenge, if that's the problem, what alternative suggestions would you think we should be making to the department to say we can solve the problem in a better way?
That's an interesting question, Ivor. That is, I don't know that I've given that angle some thought. What I do want to comment on and just maybe get your input on is, worst case scenario is we end up with a situation, and I'm focusing on the BPS sector, we end up with a situation where people are not trained by the public institutions. The private providers are not training because they're not getting access, and nobody's trained for the industry. I mean, that to me is a disaster. And I say this because I've been involved with some of the TVETs around training contact center, and they're just not capacitated. They do not have the competencies, the experience, the capacity, and they admit that themselves. So
the answer in terms of what you're saying? Is the answer not to put pressure on the department to include a section in this document or a paragraph in this document, making it incumbent on public training providers to have to engage in public-private partnerships with private training providers that the industry are prepared to endorse in that relationship? In other words, to engage in contracts which are acceptable to the levy-paying industry and the companies in that industry prior to implementation. To actually say, we can live with this as long as there's a mechanism for the private training provider to continue to offer these services to us under a relationship with the public training providers that we're prepared to endorse.
Yes, I think that makes complete sense to me. Absolutely.
Sharon, I think that that's maybe something we need to focus on. In other words, what can be added to this to create a scenario where the public training providers are forced to engage with the private providers who are selected and chosen and preferred by industry. So we demystify, because the big advantage, if we get that right, the big advantage is then that the public training provider has access to the National Skills Fund, which has billions sitting in it, which will then bring the cost of training down for the private contact center companies dramatically.
Ivor, if I hear what you're saying, I'm understanding is that business, and I include the private providers in that, we have to present something that is going to be palatable. We cannot just ignore what's on the table. We can't necessarily resist it. We can complain a lot about it, but we have to present alternatives and try and manage the process.
I'm saying that I think there are three glaring areas where contribution can be made. Number one, that the stakeholders need to be selected from the stakeholders nominated by organized business, and the minister can set criteria for the nomination, but conflict of interest is a stupid reason to exclude legitimate leadership involvement. I'm saying number two, that as far as the training providers are concerned, that there needs to be a clause in this NSCS3 that makes it possible and expected that the public training providers enter into public-private partnerships with private training providers who are acceptable to the business community paying the skills levy, so that the business community is getting the best of both worlds. They're getting the reduction in expenses because it's subsidized by government from the public training providers, but they're ensuring that the private training providers who are currently making a contribution to competency development are included in that relationship. And then I suppose I'm saying three, that the private levy-paying member companies need to be insisting that there is a clause that any tendering or quoting or levy disbursement activity has to include representatives from the levy-paying member companies themselves and their associations on those tendering committees in such a way that it's a transparent, it's an open, and it's a scrutable process.
Makes some sense, yes.
Sharon, I don't know if that makes sense in your language.
Absolutely, Ivor. Yeah, we're there. But we need to hear it from the industry, and if that's what the industry is saying, they give us the mandate, we can go and do it.
Okay. All right, guys. I don't want to belabor the point, and I don't want to take you into another hour. I just want to say from my point of view, thank you for listening to me. And Sharon, thank you for arranging this. I think it's absolutely critical.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for those that have attended. We did have 23 people, which again talks to, this is such an important point, and this is such an important happening that could skew our industry completely. But not everybody jumped on the line. So, we are going to carry on with this. We are going to make Ivor work 24 hours a day, unfortunately, to make sure we get through to absolutely everybody and take this message around. And I think, yes, Ivor, next week we have to talk to just the training providers and make it imperative that they sit up, they listen, and they just step forward and do something.
Absolutely. All right, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to address you, Sharon. I appreciate that.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's been great and very insightful. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.